He thought it was just another delivery, an old freight run no one else wanted. But when Marty Greene rolled into a Nevada ghost town, he didn't find emptiness. He found a 98-year-old World War II veteran fighting to keep the last store alive. One photo he shared with fellow drivers spread like wildfire, and what followed would shake the highway and rewrite the future of a forgotten town. Would you have stopped to help or driven on? Marty Greene had been running the roads long enough to know when something felt off about a load. The dispatch had come in late, just as he was finishing his coffee at a truck stop outside Reno. A strange run to a place he hadn't even heard of in decades. Sundown Flats. Population 6. At 61, Marty had hauled freight through every corner of the country, from icy Montana passes to the crowded ports of Louisiana. But ghost towns? Those were different. They made his chest tighten, as if every boarded-up building whispered about lives left behind. Still, freight was freight and his company needed it moved. He signed the manifest without asking too many questions. The run itself wasn't difficult. Pallets of canned goods, dry beans, some boxes of old cleaning supplies. Nothing glamorous, but the destination nagged at him. As the miles stretched and the desert unfolded in vast, cracked plains of ochre and dust, Marty couldn't help but wonder why anyone would still order supplies for a town that had all but vanished. By late afternoon, the road narrowed to a faded two-lane strip with weeds breaking through the cracks. A sun-bleached sign leaned at an angle. Sundown Flats, Pop 6. He slowed, gears grinding as the long shadow of his rig rolled over abandoned storefronts. The town was frozen in time. Windows boarded, paint curling on old billboards advertising gasoline for prices he hadn't seen since his rookie days. And then he spotted it, the single building with its lights still on. A squat general store. Its sign so faded you could barely read, Kinney's Mercantile. The open door swayed in the breeze, a faint jingle of a bell echoing when he pulled the handle. Behind the counter stood a man who looked like he belonged to another century. Walter Kinney was thin as a rail, his back curved but his posture proud. His skin was weathered from nearly a century in the Nevada sun, and his eyes were a pale, steady blue that hadn't dimmed with age. He wore suspenders over a collared shirt and moved with deliberate care, like each step was both a fight and a victory. "You the driver?" the old man asked, voice dry but sharp. "That's me," Marty said, tipping his cap. "Freight for Sundown Flats." Walter chuckled. "That's a fine way to put it. Sundown Flats hasn't had a freight drop in months. Figured we were invisible." Marty unloaded the pallets with practiced ease, but something about the way Walt leaned on the counter stuck with him. 98 years old, and still running a store in a place where most folks had packed up and gone. "You run this whole thing by yourself?" Marty asked. Walt nodded. "Been ringing folks up since the Depression. Place built this town back when the mines were alive. Now," he gestured at the empty shelves, "now it's just me. I keep the lights on, 'cause I figure somebody ought to." There was no bitterness in his tone, just stubborn grit. Marty helped him stack the new boxes, quietly impressed by how Walt refused to stand by while his town faded. He could have left, retired to somewhere warm and easy, but instead he stayed, anchoring Sundown Flats with nothing but memory and willpower. As the last crate was set down, Marty paused. Something inside told him this moment mattered. He pulled his phone from his pocket and snapped a photo. Walt standing beside the dusty storefront, one hand resting on the counter, the town's faded buildings stretching out behind him. It wasn't posed, wasn't polished. It was real. That night, parked on the edge of town, Marty keyed his CB and typed out a quick post on the trucking forum he'd been on for years. This man fought a war, built a town, and now he's fighting alone. Anyone rolling west, stop in. He's still here. He didn't think much of it. Drivers swapped stories all the time, about diners worth stopping for, mechanics who saved the day, motels to avoid. But something about that photo stuck with him as he shut down his rig and listened to the desert wind whisper against the trailer. He lay awake, eyes fixed on the cab ceiling as desert wind tapped against the trailer like an insistent visitor. He'd seen places die before, but never seen someone refuse to die with them. Walt wasn't just opening a store. He was planting a flag in the dust, daring time to take him. And for some reason Marty couldn't name. Maybe the way the old man braced against the shelf when he stood or the silence between his words. It reminded him why he still rolled. Not for the maps he completed, but for the lives that crossed his path and made him stop. As dawn broke, a thin stripe of orange split the desert sky. Marty fired up his rig, the engine's low rumble echoing through streets that hadn't heard that kind of life in years. He didn't know what would come of the photo he'd posted, or if anyone would care. But as he shifted into gear, one thought followed him down the cracked two-lane. Maybe Sundown Flats wasn't done yet. The desert had a way of keeping secrets, but the road never did. Marty's late-night post, just a photo and a few words, traveled faster than he could have imagined. By the time he was hauling his next load east, the CB chatter was already buzzing. Drivers who had never heard of Sundown Flats were suddenly swapping directions and coordinates, talking about the old vet running a store in the middle of nowhere. Walt didn't own a computer. He had no idea his weathered face was appearing on screens across trucker forums and biker boards. All he knew was that the morning after Marty left, a rig rolled down Main Street and braked in front of Kinney's Mercantile. The driver, a younger man in his 40s, stepped inside with a sack of oranges. "Thought you might need these more than me," the man said, setting them on the counter. Walt blinked. "You drove all this way for that?" The man shrugged. "Heard you were here. Figured I'd see for myself." By noon, 2 more trucks arrived. One driver bought canned beans he didn't really need. Another left a box of tools, just in case. Walt stood behind his register, hands trembling as he rang up purchases, overwhelmed by voices echoing again between his walls. But the most surprising arrival came that evening. A woman stepped out of a weathered Kenworth, her silver hair tied back under a faded ball cap. She wore boots dusted from the road and a no-nonsense grin. "Name's Georgia Johnson," she said, offering her hand. "I hauled 40 years before I parked my rig. When I heard about this place, I had to see it myself." Walt shook her hand, his voice catching. "Welcome to Sundown Flats." Georgia didn't stop at a handshake. She took one look around town. The sagging laundromat with vines crawling up its broken door, the post office with a hole in its roof, and declared, "This place doesn't need pity. It needs work." By nightfall, 6 sets of hands swung hammers in unison, nailing warped boards over broken glass, while Georgia barked orders like a captain on deck. Then, from the belly of a rust-streaked freightliner, a driver hauled out a dented generator, wiped decades of road grit from its casing, and, after 3 stubborn tries, roused it to a sputtering roar. Lights flickered in the post office. A bulb buzzed to life above the laundromat door. The street exhaled, as if remembering what it felt like to be awake. Meanwhile, Marty's post reached further than he could have dreamed. In a biker forum, the photo was reposted with the caption, "If you're rolling through Nevada, take the detour. There's a man worth meeting." Riders started sharing it, planning stops as if Sundown Flats had suddenly become a waypoint on the map. That same night, under the flickering neon of the abandoned gas station, Marty's story drew another kind of visitor. Jesse, a 17-year-old runaway, had been drifting for weeks. He'd hopped rides, slept under bridges, and finally stumbled into Sundown Flats with nothing but a torn backpack. He curled up behind the shuttered service bay, too exhausted to care about the desert chill. The next morning, Georgia nearly tripped over him. "Hey, kid," she said, nudging his boot with hers. "You lost." Jesse bristled, ready with the usual lies. But when Walt came out with a steaming mug of coffee and set it down without a word, Jesse's bravado cracked. His hands shook as he accepted the cup. Those hands told their own story, scarred, calloused, with the unmistakable grease stains of someone who'd worked on engines. "You a mechanic?" Walt asked. Jesse shrugged. "Picked up some stuff. My stepdad had a shop. I was better at fixing than he was at teaching." Walt nodded slowly. "Well, this town could use hands like that. You want a cot in the back and some hot food. It's yours." Jesse's fingers tightened around the plate, the heat from the food pressing into his palms like an anchor. His legs remembered the rhythm of escape, the quick step, the lowered head, the urge to vanish around the next corner. But now, with the weight of the meal in his hands and the quiet clink of silverware behind him, his feet stayed. He ducked his chin, mumbled something lost between breath and shame, and walked inside, shoulders hunched, steps slow but forward, just forward. By the second day, what had begun as a solitary gesture, one truck, one sack of oranges, had become a river of steel and goodwill. Engines growled into town at unlikely hours, unloading not just supplies, but fragments of hope. Bottled water still chilled from the road, boxes of nails that clinked like coins, tarps smelling of asphalt and promise. Every bolt, every can, every tool left on the store's threshold was a silent vow. You're not alone. The air smelled of dust and diesel again, but this time it carried laughter. Drivers leaned on their hoods swapping road stories, bikers grilled hot dogs over open flames, and the sound of hammers echoed against the canyon walls. Walt moved slower than the rest, but his eyes never stopped shining. He watched as Jesse patched the rusted hinges of the post office door, as Georgia coordinated repairs with the sharp authority of someone who had captained convoys across state lines, as strangers treated his town not like a relic but like a project worth saving. By the third evening, the general store was busier than Walt had seen in 20 years. The shelves, once bare, now carried donations, bags of flour, jars of jam, even fresh fruit. Jesse worked the back, unloading crates with quiet determination, while Georgia sat at the counter, laughing with Walt about her days on the road. "I thought we were ghosts out here," Walt admitted, leaning on the counter. Georgia grinned. "Ghosts don't fix roofs, Walt. Ghosts don't line up for your register. This town's still got a heartbeat. We just had to hear it." Out on the edge of town, headlights appeared. More rigs, more bikes, more people who had seen a picture of an old man standing by his store and felt something stir in their chest. Marty wasn't there to witness it, but the ripple he'd started had become a wave. Sundown Flats, once a dot fading from the map, was alive with engines, voices, and the smell of food cooking over open flames. Walt turned the key in the lock that night, shoulders squared like they hadn't been since the mines were running. The street behind him was quiet, but for once, the silence didn't feel like abandonment. It was more like a breath held before a song. Dawn would come, and with it, footsteps. Ashley Mayhew hadn't thought about Sundown Flats in years. She'd sworn she never would again. The town had been her childhood playground. Her godfather Walt, the towering figure who believed in hard work and tradition. But when she was 20, itching to leave the desert and prove herself, they'd clashed bitterly. Walt called her ungrateful. She called him stuck in the past. She left on a Greyhound with a suitcase and never looked back. Now, divorced at 45, her cooking career reduced to odd shifts in Reno, she sat at a diner booth scrolling through her phone when a familiar face stopped her cold. It was Walt, wrinkled, stooped, but unmistakably him, posted on a biker forum by some trucker she'd never met. The caption read, "This man fought a war, built a town, and now he's fighting alone. Anyone rolling west, stop in. He's still here." Ashley's fork clattered to the plate. Within hours, she was packing her car. When she rolled into Sundown Flats 2 days later, she barely recognized it. The town wasn't thriving, not yet, but it wasn't silent anymore. Trucks were parked in lines along the road. Bikers leaned against chrome Harleys outside the gas station. The faint thump of hammers and buzz of generators filled the desert air. And there, behind the counter of the general store, was Walt, 98 years old and still standing. He froze when he saw her, eyes widening as if the past itself had walked through his door. "Ashley," he whispered. "Hi, Uncle Walt," she said softly, the childhood nickname slipping out. For a moment, neither moved. Then Walt, stubborn as ever, cleared his throat and rang up the next customer as if nothing had changed. Ashley felt the sting of that dismissal, but she also felt something else, the unmistakable pull of belonging. The shelves were fuller than she remembered, but the town still lacked what it once had. The smell of frying bacon, the clatter of plates, the laughter that spilled from the old diner on the corner. The diner had been her mother's once. Ashley grew up on its greasy counters and fry baskets, When her mother passed, the building fell dark. Now, seeing the trucks and riders milling about, Ashley knew exactly what she had to do. That evening, she walked down Main Street to the abandoned building. Dust coated the windows. The sign reading Mayhew's Diner hung crooked, its paint chipped but still legible. She pushed the door open, coughing as stale air rushed out. The booths were torn, the floor warped, but she could see it. She could see life here again. "Crazy idea," Georgia Johnson said when she found Ashley inside with a broom. The retired trucker leaned in the doorway, grinning. "But I've seen crazier work." Ashley wiped her hands on her jeans. "If they're going to rebuild this town, they'll need more than canned beans. They'll need a hot meal." By morning, word had spread. Drivers hauled in spare griddles and propane tanks. A biker dropped off a box of mismatched mugs. Jesse, sleeves rolled to his elbows, rewired an old coffee maker and patched a hole in the kitchen sink. Ashley took charge, her voice carrying the same no-nonsense rhythm it once did on a line cook's shift. "You scrub that counter. Jesse, get me that wrench. Georgia, think you can wrangle up some eggs?" By noon, the diner smelled of sizzling bacon and strong coffee. A line stretched down the block, truckers, bikers, even a couple of wanderers who'd caught wind of the revival. Ashley stood behind the counter, apron tied tight, sliding plates down like she'd never left. Walt stood in the doorway, hands clasped behind his back as if holding the weight of all the years between them. He watched Ashley slide plates, the tilt of her head when she listened to an order, just like her mother used to. When he moved, it was slow, like he feared breaking a spell. He rested his fingers on the counter's edge, feeling the worn wood beneath his palm, and said, almost a whisper, "Coffee, if you still know how to make it." Ashley poured him a steaming cup. Their eyes met as she slid it across the counter. Walt's lips trembled, but he steadied them with a sip. "Not bad," he muttered, but his hand lingered on the mug as if anchoring himself to the moment. That night, the diner glowed like a beacon. Neon flickered back to life, thanks to a biker who reconnected the wiring, and the hum of voices filled the desert air. Jesse played busboy, wiping tables with surprising dedication. Georgia told road stories to a booth of laughing drivers. Ashley moved among them all, her heart swelling with a mixture of exhaustion and joy. When the rush slowed, Walt slipped into a booth near the window. Ashley sat across from him. Silence stretched until finally he spoke. "You left angry," he said quietly. "I know. You said this place would choke you." "I thought it would," she admitted. "But maybe I needed to leave to understand what it meant." Walt studied her face, his eyes glassy but sharp. Then, with a rare smile, he reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. "Your mama would be proud." Ashley's throat tightened. For years, she had carried the weight of that old argument, the guilt of walking away. But now, with the diner alive around them, she felt something she hadn't in decades: peace. Outside, the convoy of rigs hummed through the night, their engines blending into the desert wind. Sundown Flats was no longer just a ghost town. It was a gathering place again. And in the glow of Mayhew's diner, Ashley realized she wasn't just visiting. She was home. By the time the sun rose on the fourth morning, Sundown Flats no longer looked like a place waiting to die. Trucks lined the cracked streets, their trailers gleaming under desert light. Motorcycles rumbled in and out, chrome flashing as riders carried supplies from neighboring towns. The air was alive with the clatter of tools, the smell of coffee drifting from the reopened diner, and the hum of laughter rolling down Main Street. Jesse was up before dawn, sleeves rolled high as he worked beside a pair of drivers to patch the roof of the old post office. His wiry frame balanced on the ladder with surprising confidence, sweat streaking down his dirt-smudged face. Every nail he hammered seemed to drive deeper into the new life he was carving here. "Not bad for a kid," Georgia Johnson called from below, hands on her hips. She had a crew cleaning out the laundromat across the street, pulling rusted machines into the sunlight and replacing broken windows. "You ever think of turning this into a trade?" Jesse grinned faintly. "Don't know if I'll stick around long enough." Georgia winked. Funny thing about the road, it has a way of sticking to you even if you don't stick to it. By midday, the town was buzzing like a beehive. Drivers donated paint to restore faded signs. A biker rewired streetlights that hadn't glowed in years. Children from nearby ranches came to see what the noise was about, darting between the legs of workers as if Sundown Flats had always been their playground. The ghost town was gone. In its place stood a community in motion. Inside the diner, Ashley Mayhew barely kept up with the orders. The griddles hissed with bacon and eggs, and mismatched mugs clinked as coffee poured endlessly. She moved with ease now, her earlier doubts washed away in the steady rhythm of plates sliding down the counter. At one point, she looked up and saw Walt sitting in the corner booth, quietly observing with watery eyes. For all his years, he looked younger in that moment, like the boy who'd once built a town from dust and stubbornness. But the biggest surprise came that afternoon, when a tall man in a leather vest strode into the diner. He introduced himself as Ray Torres, head instructor at a diesel mechanic school in Arizona. He'd seen Jesse's photo on a biker board and decided to ride in. "Where's the kid?" Ray asked, scanning the room. Jesse, still streaked with sweat and dust, came out of the back carrying a tray of mugs. Ray gave him a long look, then pulled a folded brochure from his vest. "You've got grit," Ray said, "and grease in your veins. If you want a future, I'll make sure you've got a full scholarship waiting at my school. Housing, tools, the works. No strings." For weeks, Jesse had run. From the man who called himself father, from doors that slammed shut before he knocked, from roads that only led to more road. But now, with the crumpled brochure in his hand and Ray's steady gaze on him, something inside him stopped running. It was a beginning, a place where grease-stained hands weren't a burden, but a key. He swallowed hard, blinking fast. "I don't even know what to say." Walt, who had stepped in quietly behind him, put a hand on his shoulder. "Say yes, son. You've earned it." As evening settled, the town gathered outside. Neon from Mayhew's diner buzzed to life, casting warm color across Main Street. Bonfires sparked, surrounded by drivers trading stories over paper plates of food. Guitars appeared, their music carrying into the desert night. Marty Greene returned then, his rig groaning down the highway and braking at the edge of town. He stepped out, stunned by what he saw. Where silence had once weighed heavy, there was motion and laughter, the glow of lights against darkening skies. He found Walt near the diner, cane planted firmly in the dirt, watching it all unfold. "You made this happen," Walt said, voice rougher than the wind on the roof. Marty looked at his calloused hands, at the engines rumbling in the street, at the lights now cutting through the desert dark. "I just took a picture, Walt." The old man smiled, a faint trace on cracked lips. "Sometimes, son, that's all the world needs. Someone to stop, look, and say, 'This one matters.'" His voice cracked as he reached into his coat pocket. From it, he withdrew a small brass object, tarnished but still gleaming, the town's last ceremonial key to the city. "I thought this place would die with me," Walt said, pressing it into Marty's hand. "But you proved me wrong. You gave us back tomorrow." Marty looked at the key, heavy with history. He wasn't a man easily moved, but his throat tightened as he closed his hand around it. He'd delivered a lot of freight in his years, but nothing like this. Around them, Jessie laughed with Ray as they talked about engines. Ashley wiped her hands on her apron and leaned in the diner doorway, watching with quiet pride. Georgia clinked mugs with a circle of drivers, already planning who would take the next sundown run. The convoy that had come just to visit now refused to leave empty-handed. They were carrying a mission. Under the desert's first stars, Sundown Flats breathed with the steady rhythm of something beginning again. Laughter bounced off walls that had been silent yesterday. Guitars tuned beside engine growls, and even the wind seemed to blow differently, no longer carrying dust, but seeds. Music and laughter spilled into the night, mingling with the low hum of engines ready to roll again. And in that moment, the town was no longer a ghost. It was a promise. This story reminds us that sometimes the smallest acts can change everything. Would you have pulled over in a ghost town? or kept driving? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you felt the heartbeat of Sundown Flats, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to embrace the journey, because every road holds a story worth telling.